Everyone to our afternoon lecture here at the Gray Fossil Site. Today we have Dr. Jay Franklin with us. He's an associate professor. He studies archaeology. He's in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at ETSU and really runs the archaeology program here. And so with that, we welcome Jay. And we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Blaine. Thanks to Blaine and the folks at the museum for asking me to come out and talk. So what I'm this talk is a little bit different than one I normally give because what I want to do is tie it into sort of the natural history of our region and how that does tie into archaeology, both in terms of history but also in terms of the appearance of the landscape as well. And I'll start with a little of my own history. I decided to become an archaeologist because I wanted to study really, really ancient things. And the archaeological record in Europe and in Africa is far more ancient than the archaeological record here. And it's what fascinated me. And in point of fact, for a long time I did get, and I still do, I did get the opportunity to work in southwestern France where some of the very first prehistorians doing Paleolithic archaeology got to work, and this is me excavating at Cave 16, a Paleolithic site that dates to between about 70,000 and 11,000 years ago, and I was hooked from the beginning because when my professor who dug this site, when we first started talking about me going, he said, Jay, we do Paleolithic archaeology, we do ancient archaeology, 6 days a week we work hard. And then on Sundays we float down the river and drink red wine. And I said, "Hang on, I'll get my bag." So I got the opportunity to do this, and I still am working on a couple of projects. But almost 20 years ago, I also began to understand and really appreciate the environment in which I lived. And it's kind of funny, when I first started teaching as a graduate student, after I'd gotten a chance to excavate in France a couple of years, and started my own research program over here, I would come back and I would tell my undergraduate students, they'd say, "Wow, it must be really great to work in France. It must be awesome." And I said, "Yeah, it is really great." But I said, we have a spectacular archaeological record here, and there's nowhere more beautiful, I think, than East and Middle Tennessee. And they, "Oh, you're kidding. You got to be kidding." And I said, "No, I'm very serious. We have a fabulous landscape here." And I think it's something that people have known for a long time. This is a quote from a larger speech that Landon Carter Haynes gave in 1872. He was kind of being picked on about being from East Tennessee. And he gave a very eloquent, he was a word painter, as some historians have said, and he gave a very eloquent speech about the beauty of East Tennessee and the Watauga River. And just the last quote I'll leave you with here, but very apropos, this is Pogue Creek up on the Cumberland Plateau where I worked for several years. But people have known this for a long time. The Spanish, when they came through on two separate occasions in the 16th century, remarked what a wonderful, beautiful place East Tennessee was. They talk about the 3 months they spent in East Tennessee, and I think it was one of the only really comfortable or sort of comfortable stretches they had, and they actually got a chance to regroup, and the Native Americans were quite nice to them, and they talked about what a land of plenty it was and a beautiful land, and as I say, clearly Native Americans have known this for a very long time. And I think also, too, Native Americans have intertwined the natural landscape with the cultural landscape. And in many ways, they've imprinted their metaphysic, their cosmology onto the landscape. And so I've really, really enjoyed spending 17, 18 years doing this, working in this region. My introduction, I did some archaeological contract work to help put myself through school towards the end of my undergraduate career, or tenure, if you will, and beginning in the graduate school. But research-wise, my first beginnings were in cave archaeology. And I will admit, I was drawn quite a bit at first because caves are sort of esoteric, mysterious, sometimes can be very dangerous places. This is a cave where I did my master's thesis, and you have to crawl around this ledge to begin with to get in the cave, and then after you get in it, there's this chasm that you have to cross, and you can see people's headlamps on the other side. You have to kind of scooch across. It's about 50 or 60 feet deep. I gave a talk at the College of Charleston in 2007, and I talked about the first time I crossed this thing, and I didn't particularly care for it. And I said, yeah, when I first saw this thing, it was like 20 feet across and 1,000 feet deep, and I said, I'm not going to cross it. But I went back the next week, and it got a little smaller. It was just a few feet across and maybe 50 or 60 feet deep. And I had a couple of people come up after the talk and wanted to know the geological forces at play that caused that hole to shrink. And I assured them at that point it was really more my imagination than anything else. But I was drawn to this, and there is that aspect to it. And we get a lot of help from the caving community in Tennessee, the folks with the Tennessee Cave Survey and a lot of local grottos who have helped us do our cave work. And early on, a lot of them said, well, yeah, but Indians, Native Americans, they would never do this sort of thing. And what we found out over the course of many years is, in point of fact, they did these things, and they went miles and kilometers back in these caves to paint, to extract minerals, to extract flint. And this is how I got my start. I want to back up a little bit. One of the reasons I think this is important in our region is because Tennessee has more recorded caves than any state in the Union, well over 9,000 caves. And most of them are situated along the Cumberland Plateau, but we have lots of them here in our part of East Tennessee as well. And this is something, too, that Native Americans and later historic people obviously were quite aware of, and people used them for a variety of reasons, and they were part of their natural and their cultural landscape. In Tennessee, Patty Jo Watson worked in Mammoth and Salts Cave in Kentucky early on, but in Tennessee, some of the earliest important cave archaeology work was done by Charles Faulkner at the University of Tennessee in a place called Mudglyph Cave, which has now been gated and regated, looking at late prehistoric Native American art. This is not Mudglyph Cave. This is another one of our caves down near Knoxville, but this is one of my favorite images, but I pop it up for a couple of reasons. That's one of them. It's of a spider, and you can see where people in the mud walls of the cave just sort of trace their fingers, the front arms, and then the back legs, and 2 dots for eyes. It's very fragile art, but you can also, I think, see some other marks across here. And this is part of what got me started, along with my professor and the cave archaeology research team at the University of Tennessee, is examining and protecting this cave art in our region, and there's a lot of it, and we're finding more and more of it. But it's very fragile, and I'll show you another slide in a minute. These mudglyphs, you could be walking through a cave, and the other thing is, if you can see here, the light's coming from the side. So if you're walking through the cave often, and you walk right up to a wall with your mag light, and you do this, you're as likely not to see the image as you are to see the image. And so we've learned to light them from the sides. But a lot of people walking through the cave, you're trying not to fall down, you're trying not to get hurt. You could literally walk along this ledge, and you could rub your arm across it to keep yourself from falling, and you would rub away the image, not meaning to. Then there are other cases where there are either people who don't care or they don't know what it is that they're drawing over, marking over, and this is actually Dunbar Cave in Clarksville, Tennessee, in what's Dunbar State Natural Area, and you can go visit this. They have it roped off and they give tours of it. It's a late prehistoric cave art site. These are pictographs. These were painted with charcoal and other mixes to make them black. Those are the black images, and you can see they have tails a little bit, and it's this cross and circle design with these sort of sun figures, or what we call galushes. You see the same decorations on their pottery often. Probably talking about the axis mundi of the universe, the upper world, the middle world, and the underwater world. But somebody later in time, and you can see some other graffiti, has just marked over these things. And they may or may not have meant to. Sometimes you see it on purpose. Sometimes they didn't realize what they were marking over, just somebody else's drawing. And so it's very important to protect these sites for our collective cultural heritage, so we can study these things, so we can appreciate these things. And that's something else the caving communities also recognize. As a matter of fact, I got an email from a friend this morning. They want to do a cave cleanup here in southwestern Virginia, but they've started to call archaeologists first and say, hey, we're going to do a cave cleanup. We're going to clean off the walls, but we want people to, you guys to come in and look for these things first, so so we can make sure that in our efforts to clean off the stuff above it, we don't also scrape off the prehistoric art or stoke marks where they were stoking their torches. So it's a tricky business, but one that we're starting to understand is quite common in our region. Once I decided this is really what I wanted to do and I got hooked, I did a particular site for my master's thesis that has the very sexy name of Third Unnamed Cave. Actually, that's not its name. It actually does have a very colorful, mythological name, but this is simply the third in a series of caves that we had cave art in, among other things we wanted to protect, that to help them stay protected, we unnamed them. So this is a third in the series of those. And speaking of Patty Jo Watson, which I did a little bit ago, she was actually called to this cave in the mid-1970s because it had a series of bare footprints more than a kilometer back in the cave. And at that time, I think they recorded something like 100 of them. And so the cavers got her down there to look at them, and she believed very much that they were prehistoric. On a later trip, she noticed something else, and hopefully you can see this. This is one of the best ones. They're really hard to photograph, and not nearly 100 of them are left there anymore. But this is a left foot here, with the ball of the foot here, big left toe here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the heel back here. And it's actually in a very low passage, and you can see where somebody just walked through this passage, probably shorter than me. You can see the left, right, left through here. But a very fragile archaeological site. I got the chance to do my master's thesis here. And speaking of things that people will and won't do, once you cross that hole that I showed you before, you have to wind through about 1,000 meters. If you sort of stacked 10 football fields on end and then twisted them around pretty good, and big holes in the floor that you could fall down through, that's kind of what it's like. A lot of it's big open walking passage, some of it's crawlways. You have to watch for holes in the floor. Occasionally you'll see rocks. This is about midway through the passage where people periodically, they bundled river cane together to light torches to light their way through. Periodically you stoke the end of it to freshen the flame on a rock to keep it burning, and that's what you see here. And then when you got to the back of the cave, you essentially come to the end, but there's some holes in the ceiling. And you crawl up through them and you open back up into a big passage, and it actually winds on back behind Valerie, the second person there. But the main part of it's something like 20 yards across, 100 yards long, and maybe 4 to 6 feet high. But a big room. You can see this, hopefully with the shadows, you can see the sort of hummocky surface there. That's all from mining and digging activity that ancient Indians did in the neighborhood of 3,000 years ago. We have 15 radiocarbon dates. They all tightly cluster right around 3,000, a little older than 3,000 years ago. And they were digging chert nodules or flint nodules out of the sediments in this passage for stone tools. Here you can see one of their pits. I'm looking down into it. Over here you can see the walls of one of these pits, and you can see the vertical marks where they were taking digging sticks and digging into them. They would very quickly break these things open. They built small fires and lit them to light what they were doing. But this was a really, really logistical, very much planned activity. I talked about in this passage that led up to it, they lit their way through this passage with bundles of cane torches. Once they got up into the big room, they put the cane torches out, and all the little fires that lit their activities in here were pine and red cedar. So they were packing in firewood. 1,000 meters into this cave. Also, they had chalcedony hammerstones, which is kind of like a quartz that occurs all over the landscape up here locally. They would bring these in to break open the flint nodules, leave them in there, and they'd bring some in the next time. So probably what you had are groups of people coming in, some people responsible for lighting, some people responsible for digging, some people responsible for breaking these nodules open, but they left it all laying around. And I've made 30 some odd trips into this cave, and it's not quite in dramatic sense, but it's almost like a Pompeii. They left it just like they left it, and nothing's disturbed it since. And I still never get over the fact that when I walk into this part of the cave, how I missed them on their way out. That's the level of preservation that we're talking about. So it was a really great opportunity to be able to see exactly what they were doing back there, and we were able to reconstruct that, finding out the different kinds of wood. You can see also, although to a lesser degree, where they were knocking flakes off the flint nodules coming out of the wall. But because of this preservation, and you can see here, there's a little flint knapping pile, one episode here. You could actually refit this material, even in the cave. I did most of it in the lab, of course. But you could refit the material actually in the cave. And in so doing, you could, albeit in the reverse order, you could reconstruct the actual reduction sequence. And then what you can't put back together is what was missing, in other words, what they were taking out of the cave. And basically what they were trying to do, instead of carry a whole bunch of chert nodules out of the cave over this dangerous chasm, and believe me, I did it in backpacks, and it's dangerous, and it's, more than importantly, it's not fun at all, is they were simply trying to knock off relatively uniform, thinner flakes with thin, regular edges that once they got out of the cave, then they could fashion those into stone tools much easier. And it's a lot easier to carry out, say, maybe 30 flakes than it is 30 nodules of flint. And we were able to reconstruct this process in the cave. One of the more interesting aspects is the association of artwork with this. As I said, the deposits here date somewhere between 3,000, 3,200, 3,300 years old. But there's petroglyphs carved in the ceiling in spatial association. This one you can kind of barely see. We had a lot of fun calling him Demon Boy or whatever when we first started working at it. But in all likelihood, and we see this in some of the later art, it's probably a possum, which is a lot less spooky, although they can be kind of mean if you make them mad. But you might ask, why do people paint a possum on the side of a wall in a cave? It's been well documented ethnohistorically that a lot of Native American groups had a certain sort of reverence or respect for certain kinds of creatures who could move through different worlds. And possums, although you may more likely see them at night, you can frequently see them during the day. Raccoons as well. Evergreen trees like our own rhododendron and hemlock that don't drop their leaves in the winter but keep them all year long. Species of animals and plants like that, they had a special place for them, and they figured into their cosmology and their tales and stuff. So maybe that's why you see that here. Perhaps a sun figure. This is a series of nested spirals, which some people initially interpreted as perhaps the moon, given its proximity to what some people had termed the sun. But we know in Cherokee belief systems that these nested spirals often served as sort of portals or even warning signs, caution signs as dangerous places on the landscape. And while people used caves prehistorically, Native Americans did, they also had a certain sort of reverence or respect or fear. They were portals to the underwater world. And so one had to be very careful. Here's a couple of serpentine lines which probably indicate some sort of snake.
I have a question there.
Yes.
The checkerboard, about how many inches is that?
That's a 10 centimeter scale, so something like that is what you're talking about, yeah. And in the fashion that we liked, it was very important to protect this site, that we didn't draw so much attention to it.
And the age?
About 3,000 years ago, between 3,000 and 3,300 years ago. All the dates cluster really tightly. And we're confident of this. I didn't put a slide of it, but there's a big sort of cross-hatching pattern etched on one of the big rocks in the cave, maybe like the back of a rattlesnake or even an exaggerated rattle. We see this with one of these flint knapping piles and a little fire over it, and we dated the charcoal from that fire something like 3,100 years ago. So whatever was drawn on that surface was drawn before 3,100 years ago. Then with the landowners, a lot of the caves we've done with TVA. They've been on TVA property, some of the reservoirs. The one with the spider glyph I showed you, that was a TVA cave. And TVA Cultural Resources are very good about protecting the cultural heritage of TVA properties, and they front the money and help provide the materials to gate these caves. I will also say that these gates have to be bat friendly. so that the bat populations can move in and out of these caves. So a lot of effort is put into not only protecting the cultural resources, the archaeological heritage in this cave, but protecting the natural environment and the animals that use these caves. Same thing here. This cave is on private property. This cave is also at the bottom of a 1,000-foot gorge, which made gating it. Kristen, who is our cave gator, said this is the most difficult one that she's ever done. We did this over the course of about 6 different weekends, and it was tough because fortunately somebody had cut a road down the other side. There you can see Tim taking the tractor, taking the steel over, hauling it across that ledge I've already showed you through the cave. It was quite an ordeal, but we have it done, and we have these archaeological resources protected now. And so that people that are friends and family and local people who live in the region, as long as they, of course, go through the landowners, they're welcome to go and visit the site, as long as they don't mind that crossing that big chasm. But I had such a good time, and I really enjoyed it, and then I thought we did some really, really interesting research. I just published another paper this last year on that site for my master's thesis. We've just gotten a lot of good work and a lot of good information out of it, that I decided to expand my doctoral work in the area of the Upper Cumberland Plateau up there, because as I was taught, no archaeological site can be understood in isolation. So you have this really spectacular site, and yes, it's really, really cool, but how do we fit it into the regional sequence up there? And just very briefly, because I don't want to get into archaeological models and stuff, but when you get up on the Upper Cumberland Plateau, one of the ideas among archaeologists has always been it was a resource-poor area in terms of good flint and chert to make stone tools. So people had to go way off the plateau to get good tool stone, or they lived somewhere else and just came up to the plateau and to hunt and gather. And we know at this point that that's not true. The caves like the one that I just presented is one of several sources where they could get a lot of tool stone. There's a lot of local material out there, and we believe people were living up there year-round by as early as 5,000 years ago. And this is a spitballing term here. I said land of 10,000 rock shelters. It could be 20,000. It's a very unique landscape in that regard, in that we've done some winter surveys where we've covered about a 2-kilometer stretch of bluff line and recorded 50 different rock shelter sites along that stretch of bluff line. It's just amazing. And so I rolled this over into my dissertation. It's also a very geologically and ecologically beautiful landscape. And of course, I think most of us know we live in southern Appalachia. It's one of the most ecologically diverse regions in the entire world. And I'm sure Native Americans were aware of the diversity of resources in this landscape as well. And people tend to like variety. People tend to like to be able to draw from different resources to help them survive and thrive. And I'm sure they recognize this in the Cumberland Plateau. You get a lot of these natural arches and these rock shelters. It's a gorgeous landscape. It's just a fabulous place to work, generally speaking. And I love spending my time out here. But we've spent now, this is 2013, the last 17 years as of last month, doing work up here in the caves, in the rock shelters, constructing the regional culture history up there, and learning how people lived and exploited the landscape. This is in Pogue Creek State Natural Area. This is a big rock house. We call this one Hemlock Falls Rock House. And in wet weather, there's a pretty good waterfall that comes down along to these big hemlocks. But this is a nice dry archaeological site, so we had some good preservation here. We got a lot of charcoal and we got animal bones, which was nice. Unfortunately, we're not the only people interested in the archaeological record up here. And to doubly confound that, we weren't nearly the first people up here to be interested in it. And if you read a lot of the old documents, and in particular a lot of unpublished manuscripts, which the Tennessee Division of Archaeology has on file, local folks have been investigating and digging in these cave sites from the Civil War on. 150 years, maybe, that they've been digging these sites. And I'll have more to say about that in a second, but you can see this is what we call 22nd Unnamed Cave. It does have a dark zone farther back behind Aaron, beyond the reach of ambient light, and we have some pictographs back there, but this is a great living area out in the vestibule entrance of the cave. Lots of really black dirt, organically rich dirt. But you can see it's just been destroyed. There's a bucket from digging up there outside the front of this cave, and it's down in the bottom of this gorge too, and it sits probably 150 feet up off the river. It's not easy to get to. There's a big mechanical sifter sitting out in front of this cave. I don't know how in the world they got it up there. But we were able to get no information. We were able to mostly date the pictographs in the back, but we got no information from this area. A few pieces of pottery, and we did some test excavations, but it was all we could do. It was just completely destroyed. And as I said, there's a 150-year history of doing this up here. This is another site that we did some work on, and we did get a good sequence here, and we actually managed to publish a paper, but this site has been dug and dug and dug and dug. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a minute. This is from 2007 when I brought my French colleagues over. These mounds of dirt that Lucinda and Violaine are standing on, that's all from digging. Just people digging, throwing it out. Here you can see where they've piled up a bunch of flint and artifacts on it. Now, the purpose of me talking about this is not to get after people so much, because particularly in the Plateau area where this is happening, these are people who are interested, and I know a lot of them, and many of them are friends. And I would probably still be working on my doctoral dissertation if it weren't for some of them. That's how much help they've been to me. But it's a different mindset, and a lot of these people don't dig to sell things and put them on eBay. They dig because they're interested. They dig because it's a rite of passage, it's a pastime. I have some friends up there, a very prominent family, who have let me dig on a lot of their property, and when Jerry's grandson got of a certain age, they took him out for his first arrowhead dig, and his mom made him a little plaque and put it all up and said, you know, Jacob's first arrowhead dig with Grandpa, and then put the date on everything. It's just part of what people do. I think some people go out sometimes. We ran across 2 or 3 guys one Sunday morning several years ago. They were digging in a rock shelter that there was no dirt left in. They were just kind of messing around in the creek in front of it, and sometimes it's like, you know, maybe they just didn't want to go to church this morning, or maybe they didn't want to mow the yard this afternoon, so, you know, we're going to go out and do something. But they're interested people. Almost as much as we are, maybe more so in some cases, they're interested in the prehistory of the region they live in, and they go out and do these things. So a big part of what we do up there is, and particularly with our work with the folks at Pickett State Park, is trying to educate people into why we dig the way we dig. And part of it is to record the maximum amount of information, but part of it is to leave a decent imprint on the landscape. It's aesthetically not attractive to walk up on these beautiful geologic and ecologically diverse places and see this stuff and garbage laying around. And so I have a local friend up there, and he spends an awful lot of his own time reclaiming a lot of these rock shelters. He puts them back. And this is that same shelter I just showed in the last 2 slides, and he's leveled it all out, cleaned it up, picked out all the garbage, and made it look better. This was in 2008, but then people go back, and they've already dug these sites up, and they've already dug them up, and they've already dug them up, and they know my friend has put them back, and they dig them up again, and they get mad at him for putting them back. And so that's part of it. And these, unfortunately, are actually some in the park that have been dug up. You can see a big hole here. Here you can see where they've built a tripod to hang their screen off of, and these piles of dirt back here. It's a very common thing. Now, some of these were probably dug 50 years ago, and then the people who dug them aren't even around anymore. But it's something that we have to try and deal with, both from an 3 things: an educational perspective, an aesthetic perspective, but also in trying to extract important or useful historical information from sites that have been significantly disturbed. Well, why does this matter? I think, and hopefully that's where I'm going to end, is that there's some very interesting things that I think a lot of people find very interesting about their area. And this is one of my favorite sites. This is Jan Chimmick from the University of Tennessee. It's a natural art shelter. You can see it. It's just a big arch. It opens up here. We have 2 or 3 of these here. And all this where you see these shadows around the rock has just been dug up extensively. but it has this really spectacular artwork, these pictographs. That's one of them right there, and we're pretty sure April didn't draw them, or Jack. But again, you can see some of the graffiti issues we have as well. Fortunately, April and Jack didn't draw over our pictograph here. But we don't. We have quite a bit of artwork up there, some of these petroglyphs that I showed you. We don't have many of these pictographs or paintings up there. And we think in the late prehistoric period in this part of the plateau that we might be on this boundary area between what we call Mississippians to the south and Fort Ancient peoples to the north. And this was a fluid boundary, and that's why if you go down on the southern part of the plateau and the southern part of Tennessee, these pictographs are all over the shelters and caves down there. But we have very few of them up here, so they're important to study. They're important to understand these relationships of these people to each other in this fluid boundary, but also some of their cosmological beliefs. And they're very much exposed and very much in danger. And just since I showed the site from a preservation perspective, this is, and why we named the site this, but this is clearly not a real creature. It looks like a dog. Actually, I don't have a picture of the red disc circle, but when we first told about it several years ago by the locals, they called it the fox in the basket. The fox in the basket. I had no idea why that's the case, but kind of looks like a fox. It's got a little bit of a bushy tail, and the big disc has what looks to be like a handle carved in it. Basket. But in any case, it's clearly not a real creature. It kind of looks like a dog, but it's kind of got these horns or pointed ears. It's got talons instead of paws. It's kind of bowed up a little bit. But this image you see in here is actually a coiled up snake. There's the body coiled up. There's the head, and with its tongue sticking out. Now, a lot of Native American cosmology, dogs figured importantly, particularly in the Mississippian and the historic period, in guiding people west towards the afterlife. And so, and people have enjoyed their dogs as pets for many years too. So they figure very prominent. But this is a mythological creature, very clearly, and we don't get much of it, so it's important to protect it. And then finally, in talking about the plateau, and this is a site that we just found last March of 2012. We did a winter field school in winter of this year, in December and January, and a former student of mine who's now one of the park rangers up there talked me into, he said, hey, we need to test this rock shelter, and you need to let some of your students get some excavation experience. And so I said, okay. So we did a couple of test excavations in January, and we realized we had a site that had not been disturbed at all. And based on some of what I've shown you already, that just doesn't happen very often. In point of fact, it's quite rare. So we got pretty excited about that. We had some pottery that dates to maybe 1,500 years ago. We had a stone tool and some stone bowls in layers underneath that date to probably 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. So it's like, this is really nice. We have a nice sequence here, an undisturbed sequence. We had some bone, had some charred nutshell. And it's like, this is a good site. We can get a lot of information here, but we can get a historical sequence here. So we made plans to go back out over spring break, and we did. And in addition to a couple of these test units, I cut a big slot trench perpendicular to the axis of this shelter, and we got down about 5 feet, you can see here, and we started pulling up very different looking tools. This is a blade tool, which strictly defined is a flake that's twice as long as it is wide. Had a little graver spur on the end. It's retouched along one side. This is an ancient tool. And speaking of my interest in France, these Upper Paleolithic assemblages that we talk about, they're all blade tool assemblages. But we don't have a lot of that over here until the very end of the Pleistocene, maybe 15,000 years on. So I was a little curious when I pulled this out. And just below it then, I got this big biface, which was maybe a preform or a blank for a Clovis point, which is some of the earliest the earliest archaeological culture that we really know a lot about in the South, in North America, in fact. But what's interesting about this site to me is in the South, generally speaking, for very ancient sites, we don't get stratified sites. We get them disturbed. You can find Clovis points, these Paleo-Indian points, even on some of the reservoirs around here, but they're not in their original context. Okay? Second of all, they tend to be in bigger river valleys along major streams, very close to chert and flint resources, and who knows, at the end of the Pleistocene on this highland landscape on the plateau, it may not have been very hospitable, or at least less hospitable than it is down in the river valleys. We didn't expect to see this up here. So there are two things that I think are very important about this site. So we have some of the earliest Americans at this site, generally speaking, and we have it in stratified, undisturbed deposits, which really never happens this old. And second of all, that they're up on this plateau and not down along a major river valley. So we're really excited to get back out here next winter. As a matter of fact, some days I find it hard to sit still when I'm sitting in my office thinking about it. But it's also going to be very difficult, based on what I've just showed you, to protect this site. Now, fortunately, for some reason, it's not been disturbed for decades and decades, unlike a lot of them. We dig in the winter so as not to draw too much attention to it, but it's going to be a little tricky to protect this site. And as we do more and more work here, we're going to have to be aware of this. And so, you know, even with my later sites, I've always been aware when I go back the next year, when I go back the next summer, the next spring, that site may not be there, or somebody could have dug into it. And so I'm constantly aware of this, and this site in particular, we're very, very cautious about, but very, very excited about too. We can't wait to get back. So that's where I've done most of my work, really, in the last 17 or so years. Closer to home, when I came to ETSU in 2004, my wife actually went to school here and played tennis here, but I grew up in Chattanooga and went to school in Knoxville. But we came back to East Tennessee after my first job at the University of Memphis, and a little bit here and there with S.D. Dean, who's doing some artifact ID upstairs. I started doing some work with S.D. This is a little rock shelter out along the Holston, similar kind of situation, except for this is limestone instead of sandstone. A disturbed shelter. We got a little bit of information out on it. Still have yet to write this one up because they just dug a big hole out of the bottom of it, so we didn't get a lot of information, but one of the latest dated pottery sherds might actually be early Cherokee. But I began to get interested in it, and as I began to get interested in it, I began to meet people around here who are avocational archaeologists. Many of them who were members of the old Kingsport chapter of the old Tennessee Archaeological Society. And I kind of got interested in the area, but when I came back to Tennessee, East Tennessee, in this part of East Tennessee, I was really struck by the reference people made to Cherokees, even all the way back into prehistory. And there's never really been great archaeological evidence for that. Point of fact, early archaeological surveys would have you believe that there wasn't great evidence for much in the way of archaeology in our region. This is a TVA technical report from 1958. You can see Watauga, South Holston, Boone, and Fort Patrick Henry. I've highlighted in yellow no archaeological manifestations of any importance in the area. Not suitable for permanent Indian habitation, and that apparently there were no prehistoric village sites. Well, story over, right? 1958, we're done. Now, in fairness, in 1958, the fledgling archaeology program at the University of Tennessee was grossly overwhelmed, because we have a fabulous archaeological record all across our state. And they were pulled in so many different directions, and you can't do everything. And I'm sure Blaine knows this as a paleontologist. Because of the nature of some of these sites and protecting them, you want to get to everything. Nobody can do it all. And I'm sure that's a lot of what they were faced with in some of this. But I think it's led to this idea that this has sort of been an archaeological black hole, except for maybe local people, for a number of decades. Even early archaeological projects. This was Bob Lafferty, who's a fabulous archaeologist, but he did some work at Phipps Bend in the 1970s in preparation for what was going to be the nuclear facility. But he found mostly ancient sites, 2,000–3,000 years old. The late prehistoric period, what we would call these village sites, he said they're not here. And so he said the late prehistory, kind of like that 1958 report, really unintense. People might have still been practicing a little bit of horticulture, largely hunting and gathering. not much to it. I don't know how much, if any, I've talked to Bob quite a few times, he knew about this site just upstream. But as I began to get to know people here, they had collections from their parents who dug at this site with the old Kingsport Archaeological Club, and it was very evident to me early on that this was a village site, a late prehistoric village site, and a couple of these people donated their collections to the archaeology laboratory, and we began to work with them. Now, I've sort of already given this away a little bit, but I'll pose the question. What's the knee-jerk answer when you, who were the Native Americans who lived in our region before we did? The Cherokees. And we talk about that all the time. There's clearly historical documentation that that was the case in the late 1700s. And that's the answer you get. So here's the history of the research problem around here. And again, some of this has just kind of fallen right out before us in the last few months, although we've been working at it for a few years now. One of the earliest explorers, long hunters, Dr. Thomas Walker, in his explorations through this area, made camp 4 miles downstream from the junction of the Forks of the Holston, just above Kingsport, on the north bank, across from, as he put it, an abandoned Indian fort. That's all he says, it's an Indian fort. Now later on, Muriel Spoden, in writing, and she may have been drawing from some other sources, I don't know, wrote, in talking about this, the Walker camp across the river from the Cherokee Indian fort was located at or near Solitude Ford. Now I don't know in particular why that was referred to at this point as a Cherokee fort, other than maybe some of the historical documents from the late 18th century. And that assumption is not unreasonable at all. It's just that up to that point, up to this point, one could even argue it's not been demonstrated archaeologically in stratified archaeological excavations. When you couple that with the materials that we got donated to us and the notes and the photographs from the Holliston Mill site, it was very much what we might call a Mississippian site, very characteristic of probably Muskogean speakers farther south in the Tennessee Valley. And the Muskogean's the only native language group to the south. The Cherokees, in fact, are Iroquoian speakers, a northern language group. And at some point in prehistory, they migrated southward. But a very Mississippian, we have a lot of houses, probably what was a big council house. You can see the post holes here. And if you look at the pottery, though, it's not Cherokee pottery. The earliest pottery of the site is what we call Pisgah, which Charles Hudson and some others used to refer to as prehistoric Cherokee, but it has a very wide distribution range throughout southern Appalachia. And as one of my colleagues put it, none of us are really sure what Pisgah exactly is at this point. It has its origins about 1000 AD. And as he said, it might likely be from outer space. Now, that's not true, of course, but we're still trying to put that together. But about the 1400s, maybe earlier than that, you get what we call Dallas pottery. Again, much more characteristic of the valley farther south below Knoxville and into North Georgia. It's part of a chiefdom that was called Coosa. It's made with crushed up river mussel shell and has this cord marking on it. It's very different than Cherokee pottery. And so this was probably some sort of Muskogean-speaking group or some other group, it appears, than the Cherokee. So some of my ideas as early as 2006, 2007 were, well, the Cherokees may have gotten here at some point, but the people before them were Muskogean speakers, maybe Coasati. Some people thought Yuchi, some people thought Chiska, but not early on, not Cherokee. But what we do know now is this business of no village sites and unintense occupation is not true. Here's Phipps Bend, where that nothing was found. A kilometer upstream we have the ASG site, the late prehistoric site. The Holliston Mill site, a big village site, lots of houses. It had walls or stockades built around it. The Arnold site, here's the location of these, probably what Walker's stockaded forts were. Given the fact that the Rotherwood site just north of it and the Holliston Mill site south of it were Dallas sites, this one probably was too, and you have some of this also in and around the Long Island. Okay? But right now, as we understand, there are a lot of towns and hamlets here now, and as it turns out, a lot of them. Now, to kind of wind down where we are now, and heading back closer to this way on the Watauga and Nolichucky, a lot of people know about a local site called the Austin Spring Site. It's been dug on and off, again, mostly not by archaeologists, but we know a little bit about it as early as the 1950s. It was written a mixed population, and by mixed we assume they were talking about Cherokees and Euro-American peoples. You had some typical Native American artifacts with some iron trade axes, but they suggested a date of about 200 years ago, or 1750. But that's an acceptable, the idea of Cherokee then is acceptable for that late a date. It's likely then the Cherokee pushed over the mountains like they did in the overhill towns farther south, that they pushed over into this area, at least maybe some small hamlets and hunting territories and things like that. So it makes sense, but the date suggested was 1750. Well, we began doing some informal surface collections. Part of the site is under the pool level of Boone Reservoir, and a good bit of the site is above it. We started doing some surface collections and dating the pottery, and two things stood out. If you look at the pottery, it doesn't look like that Holliston Mills pottery, that Dallas pottery, what may be Muskogee pottery. It looks very Cherokee. And not exactly like the Cherokee, what we call Qualla, from western North Carolina, but really, really close. But it's not this Dallas stuff, and it's not tempered with crushed up mussel shell. It's tempered with crushed up quartz and grit, like Cherokee pottery is. But these designs, this incising, these punctations, this cob rough stuff, it's Qualla, it's Cherokee. That's interesting enough anyway. But then we started dating the pottery from the site. It's late 1400s, early 1500s. It's really early Cherokee stuff. And this really got our interest, and it also piqued the interest of some of my colleagues who know Cherokee archaeology far better than I do. This is a duck head effigy that came from one of the tops of the vessels, or if you really want to be a hardcore paleontologist, it's a hadrosaur, Corythosaurus effigy. It's a duck. But really interesting, neat pottery that came off the site. Then a few months ago, actually, my friend and colleague John Marcoux wrote about this as early as a couple of years ago. He and Brett Riggs found some unpublished accounts in the library at North Carolina from Charles Hicks, who was an early Cherokee leader, recounting this. Only two resting places, talking about the Cherokees, in their immigration, presumably from the north, before they finally reached on the lands of their rest in western North Carolina. And the first of which is mentioned was Anikayunglia, which has reference to some area in the neighborhood of southeastern Kentucky, southwest Virginia, northeast Tennessee. Okay, somewhere between the headwaters of the Holston Clinch and Cumberland waters. And then their next one was somewhere near Nonaklukung, which translates to spruce tree place or the Nolichucky. And then from there, it is presumable that the nation separated, and by that he means some of them pushing into western North Carolina. And discussing this with some of my other colleagues, the stuff we have here now we think is very early Cherokee, looks really similar to stuff from western North Carolina, but quite a bit different than later overhill Cherokee stuff from southeastern Tennessee. So you may have had Cherokee communities all over southern Appalachia as early as the 1400s and perhaps even earlier. And it appears now that we have them right here. Very close to the Austin Spring site is the Ford site. We have very similar dates from it, but we have a mix of some of this pottery. Here's some of this shell-tempered pottery. We don't yet know if it's that Dallas stuff or if it's overhill, because the overhill Cherokee did temper their pottery with shell, a lot of it. But this early date would suggest Dallas, but its association with the rest of the assemblage from the Ford site would suggest Cherokee, because this is very typical Cherokee pottery here. Some of it actually comes from farther away on the eastern side of the Appalachians in North Carolina, and what may have been the ancestors of the Catawban-speaking peoples, the soapstone tempered stuff. Really, really interesting, but early mix of pottery in our area. The problem, and again, from a preservation perspective, is we already are hampered by the nature of the landscape around here. Boone Reservoir, some of the other reservoirs. Here, and you can see my photo scale, this is a deflated hearth, meaning there's no soil or deposition. The raising and lowering of the reservoir every year has just washed away everything. And so we have to deal with that enough as it is. Then we also have problems. People dig out here as well. You can see all these little mounds of dirt where they're digging. You can see these four-wheeler tracks through here. Now the landowner at this site has taken recent steps to stop a lot of this. But we have some very early Cherokee sites. We've talked a lot with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee lately and a lot of other people that we want to investigate these. We want to be able to talk about Cherokee history in our region. And very early important sites, but we have these factors working against us to protect them between the lake raising and lowering and artifact digging and four-wheeling and recreational activity. And it seems in some places to get worse here. But now this is not that site, but this one's just upstream a little bit. We have 3 dates from this site. I don't know that we can ever really do much with it, but it got hammered this past winter, really worse than I've ever seen it in 9 years of living here. And so this is in part what we're up against in trying to save some of the history of our region. On the Nolichucky, we've also discovered a new site just here in the last couple of years that appears to be a large Cherokee town that we tentatively dated between 1625 and 1700 based on the ceramics we recovered. And I would have put it in here, but I'd already finished my presentation. We got our first radiocarbon date back about 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon on charcoal from one of the Cherokee pieces of pottery, 1650. So it fits really nicely within this area, but the site has enormous, first of all, other than some corn plowing, it's not been disturbed, and some tomato planting. The landowner is a very nice gentleman, has told us we can do a lot of work out here. It has enormous potential because along the riverbank is a big trash dump. You don't find big vessels anymore or parts of vessels anymore. So we've already done some vessel reconstruction. We can talk about vessel function, variation in vessel form. Up on the plateau where I work, we get crumbs of pottery. And you can't do a lot with that other than sort of identify about what time period it is. But here, we can talk about vessel form and compare it to other sites in the region and talk about interactions. We can also, because of its undisturbed nature, our colleague here, Eileen Ernenwine, who's a geophysical specialist, and she's really excited to get out there, we can go out there with geophysical equipment, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometer, and we'll be able to, because it would take decades to excavate this site, but we can go out there with geophysical equipment and get an idea of the number of houses out there, the community patterning and structuring. Was it palisaded or walled off? And we can learn a lot about this site now with not a minimum amount of work, but maybe not 20 or 30 years worth of work, which we would never get to. We'd all have to live to be ancient people. So it has enormous, enormous potential. Now, in closing, why I think this is relevant to Earth Day is because I think it's about preserving both our natural and our cultural history, heritage in our area. And I'm not so sure that they're not really intertwined. And so we try and do the best we can to educate people, not to scold people, but to educate them. But part of it is to remind them that in many cases this is illegal. In a lot of the areas of the plateau where we dig, we are on state property, sometimes federal property. This is a sign we have posted in that rock shelter site that I just talked about. And this site has a camera as well now too. So it is illegal to do this. And TVA on our region's reservoirs has a very active program of policing illegal artifact hunting and digging. And so I caution people about that too. But I think more importantly is this. And I didn't make this up. This is another archaeologist who wrote this several years ago. It sounds a bit melodramatic, but there's a lot of truth to it. Archaeologists are the only scientists who kill their informants of in the process of interviewing them. And it, you know, again, that's a bit melodramatic, but it's like, oh, I really meant to ask a couple more questions, and now you can't. And that's the thing. Whether you're doing it as an archaeologist in a controlled scientific manner, or you're just an interested person who's going out there digging, you can't go back and redo it. And so if you miss something the first time, if you didn't get the information you wanted, you didn't make good notes or photographs, you can't go back and redo it. And everybody likes to find stuff. I still tell students all the time, I never get over the discovery part of my job. It's just fascinating. It just never gets old. But I like to find it where it belongs, because then I can say a lot more about that material. And I can hopefully, as I give more of these talks, as I write stuff, I can tell people not only better stories, but more informed, more accurate stories, instead of just saying, well, this is a nice spear point that we think dates to maybe 11,000 years ago. Or this looks like Cherokee pottery like you'd find in western North Carolina, but we don't really know because we picked it up off the beach out on the lake. We need to find it in its original archaeological context. And in that regard, I think we all need to work together. And in point of fact, we have a lot of avocational people that work with us. We know a lot about the archaeological record because of these people. We need to do it together so that we don't dig any more than we have to. We don't dig without particular research questions. And that in our zeal to discover not only artifacts and information, but that we also protect these things, that we don't dig and excavate any more than we can keep up with or without having a good reason to do it. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much for your time.
I have a question. Was this area glacial or not, or interglacial?
Here, no. I think, you know, there's been a lot of research done in the Smoky Mountains looking for evidence of glaciation up there. I think the jury's still out on that unless there's been some new research I'm not aware of. And I also don't think on the plateau where we were it was glaciated. But it still may have been, well, I mean, you know, if you spend any time in the mountains, even at not high elevations, it can still be, if you go up to Roan Mountain, I've been up Roan Mountain days where it's like, you're running around Johnson City, it feels pretty good, and you get up in Roan Mountain and it's 30 degrees and the wind's going to blow you off the top of it. So the climate can be very different, or the weather, but I don't think, certainly not down here in our valleys, was there any glaciation. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What were the tribes that settled on the New River and coming down the Clinton coast?
Well, that's an interesting question because some of it depends on whom you ask, but some of it, as you particularly get into the historic period, and by that I mean as early as the Spanish, but then the French and the English, some of these people stayed so little time in certain places, it's hard to pin them down. There's a group called the Chizka, which people have written about, but we don't know much about them. There are a group of scholars who think that they settled part of that southwestern Virginia area. But you also have some of this Dallas stuff up there in certain drainages as well. But the thing is, we don't know much about the Chizka. And if you look at some maps and some interpretations, it looks like they may have been in northeastern Tennessee. But they pop up all of a sudden in something like 1624 down on the edge of Spanish missions in Florida, like that. So they're moving. Some of those were the Westos. The Yuchi were still trying to figure out their movements from the late prehistoric, proto-historic, even to the historic period. So it's difficult. And what some scholars have talked about, some of my colleagues have talked about, particularly after you get Europeans sort of ruffling things up, and that's putting it mildly and diplomatically, but is that you get these coalescent communities. In other words, even in some cases, they may have been of the same people, the Cherokees, for example, but they came from different Cherokee communities, and when you excavate the material remains from their houses, this is down in Townsend, this has been documented by John Marcoux, that each household has its own sort of distinct pottery tradition. It all appears they were Cherokees, but different traditions. But it's also been documented historically that you may have had these coalescent communities of people from different groups. In point of fact, the confederacy that we call the Creeks was an amalgamation of many different cultural and ethnic groups, in fact. So as we get into the historic era, that goes beyond my realm of expertise, but also pinning these people down archaeologically long enough is sometimes very difficult as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again for coming.